1941. The North Atlantic had become a graveyard, and Commander James Rowland stood on the rain-slicked deck of HMS Westcott, watching yet another merchant ship disappear beneath the waves. The convoy system was failing. Depth charges, those barrel-shaped explosives that had seemed so revolutionary in the Great War, were proving woefully inadequate against Karl Dinitz's Wolfpacks. The problem was simple, brutal, and maddening. By the time a destroyer reached the spot where sonar had detected a U-boat, the submarine had already slipped away into the dark depths, warned by the very sound of the attacking vessel's approach. In the Admiralty's dimly lit offices on Whitehall, a peculiar proposal landed on desks already buried under requisition forms and casualty reports. Lieutenant Commander Charles Goodeve, a physicist-turned-naval officer, had been working with the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, a name that inspired either hope or derision, depending on one's disposition. His team had designed something that looked, to the uninitiated eye, like an oversized pincushion mounted on a ship's bow. They called it the Hedgehog. It's a rotating drum that fires 24 contact-fused mortar in a circular pattern ahead of the ship, Goodeve explained to a room full of skeptical Royal Navy officers. The silence that followed was deafening. One commander, a veteran of Jutland with salt and pepper whiskers and a chest full of medals, actually laughed. "You want us to replace proven depth charge racks with what appears to be a carnival game? We're fighting U-boats, Goodeve, not shooting at coconuts at a fair." The criticism wasn't entirely unfair. The Hedgehog stood 4 feet tall, with 24 spigots arranged in a circle that would fire projectiles weighing 35 pounds each. These weren't the massive depth charges that could damage a submarine with their shock wave alone. They were small, finned bombs that would only detonate on direct contact with a submarine's hull. Miss entirely, and they'd sink harmlessly to the ocean floor without exploding. To experienced naval officers, this seemed like a step backward. According to documents housed in the Imperial War Museum archives, initial trials in late 1940 revealed that the weapon's firing mechanism was temperamental, occasionally launching mortar at unpredictable angles or failing to fire at all. Commander Rowland, however, saw something others missed. The genius of the Hedgehog wasn't in its explosive power, it was in its silence. Traditional depth charge attacks required a ship to pass directly over a submarine's suspected position, losing sonar contact at the critical moment. The submarine commander, hearing the destroyer's engines overhead, would take evasive action during those precious seconds of blindness. The Hedgehog fired forward while the attacking ship maintained sonar contact, meaning the submarine crew had no warning until the mortar were already falling through the water column toward them. But convincing the Royal Navy's Old Guard would require more than theory. It would require blood, iron, and the desperate arithmetic of convoy warfare. By early 1942, Britain was losing merchant ships faster than they could be built. The U-boats were winning, and everyone in the Admiralty knew it. Prime Minister Winston Churchill had privately confided to his staff that the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat peril. Something had to change, and it had to change quickly, or Britain would starve before American production could make a difference. 1942 brought the bleakest months of the Battle of the Atlantic. In January alone, German submarines sank 62 Allied ships, sending over 300,000 tons of desperately needed supplies to the bottom. The Admiralty, facing mounting pressure from Churchill himself, reluctantly approved expanded trials of the Hedgehog system. HMS Vanoc, a V-class destroyer under the command of Lieutenant Commander John Waterhouse, became one of the first vessels to receive the controversial weapon. Waterhouse was a pragmatist, not an idealist. He'd survived the Norwegian campaign and the evacuation of Dunkirk, experiences that had taught him to distrust revolutionary promises. When the installation crew welded the Hedgehog mount to his ship's foredeck in Liverpool Harbor, he gathered his officers for a frank assessment. "Gentlemen, we're to be guinea pigs for the Boffin's latest contraption. I expect it will jam at the worst possible moment, and we'll still need to rely on our depth charge racks when it matters." His executive officer, Lieutenant Peter Gretton, ran his hand along the Hedgehog spigots with the wary respect one might show a strange dog. "The theory is sound, sir. Forward-throwing contact fuses mean no wasted explosives, no false kills. But theory doesn't survive first contact with a U-boat commander who knows his business. They got their first opportunity in March of 1942, while escorting convoy on 72 through the mid-Atlantic gap, that deadly stretch beyond the range of land-based aircraft where submarines hunted with near impunity. At 0300 hours, in seas running 20-foot swells, the sonar operator reported a contact bearing 270 degrees, range 1,200 yards. Waterhouse ordered action stations, and HMS Vinoc's crew scrambled through the darkness to their battle positions. As Vinoc closed the distance, maintaining perfect sonar contact thanks to the Hedgehog's forward-throwing design, Waterhouse gave the order to fire. The night erupted with a distinctive whoosh-whoosh. 24 mortar arced through the darkness, their trajectories forming an elliptical pattern 200 yards ahead of the ship's bow, then nothing. The mortar sank without exploding, and Waterhouse felt his heart sink with them. "Missed clean," he muttered. "Reload and prepare for depth charge attack." But the sonar operator's voice cut through his disappointment. "Contact moving, sir." "Bearing 285, range increasing?" "She's diving deeper and turning hard to port." The submarine was still there. Still moving, which meant they could try again. This time, Waterhouse adjusted the firing solution based on the U-boat's new course and depth. The Hedgehog fired again, and 5 seconds later, a deep, resonant boom echoed through the ship's hull, then another and another. 7 distinct detonations, direct hits on a pressure hull 80 feet beneath the surface. Reference materials from the National Archives at Kew Gardens indicate that HMS Vinoc's action report, filed on March 18, 1942, confirmed the destruction of U-587, a Type VIC U-boat under the command of Captain Lieutenant Rolf Borchert. 46 German sailors died in the freezing Atlantic that morning. It was the Hedgehog's first confirmed kill, and it silenced many of the weapon's critics. Word spread quickly through the destroyer fleet. The rotating drum that had been mocked in officers' messes suddenly became the subject of intense interest. Captains who had viewed the Hedgehog as a waste of valuable deck space now requested priority installation, but the weapon had its detractors still. Some pointed out that 7 hits out of 24 projectiles was only a 29% accuracy rate, hardly impressive. What they failed to understand was that with depth charges, accuracy was impossible to measure because the explosions destroyed evidence of near misses or hits. The Hedgehog's silence when it missed was actually a tactical advantage, allowing for repeated attacks without alerting the submarine crew. 1943 marked the turning point, though few recognized it at the time. By spring, the Admiralty's Operational Research Section, a group of scientists and mathematicians tasked with analyzing combat effectiveness, began compiling data that would revolutionize anti-submarine warfare. Professor Patrick Blackett, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who had turned his considerable intellect toward military problems, presented findings that shocked even the most optimistic proponents of the Hedgehog system. Traditional depth charge attacks, according to Blackett's exhaustive analysis of convoy actions, resulted in a submarine kill only 5% of the time. 5 attacks out of every 100 produced a confirmed sinking. The numbers were so dismal that some officers initially refused to believe them, insisting their own experiences proved otherwise. But Blackett's team had been thorough, cross-referencing British action reports with captured German records and post-war interrogations of U-boat crews. The conclusion was inescapable. Depth charges were largely ineffective, their success rate inflated by wishful thinking and the impossibility of confirming kills in the chaos of combat. The Hedgehog, by contrast, showed a kill rate of approximately 15 to 20% by mid-1943. This threefold increase wasn't merely statistical noise, it represented hundreds of merchant seamen who would live instead of drowning in burning oil, thousands of tons of cargo that would reach British ports instead of rusting on the ocean floor. Captain Donald McIntyre, commanding the 2nd Escort Group, became one of the weapon's most vocal advocates after using a Hedgehog-equipped destroyer to sink U-137 in April of 1943. McIntyre's tactical innovation went beyond simply adopting the new weapon. He developed what became known as the creeping attack, where one destroyer would maintain sonar contact while a Hedgehog-equipped vessel approached slowly, matching the submarine's speed and heading before firing. This technique, described in McIntyre's post-war memoir, U-Boat Killer, eliminated the element of luck almost entirely. The submarine commander, hearing no engine noise above him, would maintain course and depth, unaware that death was descending in the form of 24 70-pound projectiles. The psychological impact on U-boat crews proved as significant as the tactical advantages. Survivors pulled from the Atlantic after their boats were destroyed by Hedgehog attacks described a particular terror that depth charges had never inspired. With depth charges, the crew could hear them detonating nearby, could feel the pressure waves, could take some comfort in surviving each near miss. The Hedgehog was different silent until the moment of impact, when 7 or 8 or 12 projectiles would punch through the pressure hull simultaneously, flooding compartments faster than watertight doors could be closed. Captain Lieutenant Peter Creamer, who survived the war and later wrote a detailed memoir, described the Hedgehog as the weapon we feared most, more than aircraft, more than destroyer screens, more than anything else the Allies deployed. But the weapon wasn't without its challenges. The contact fuses were sensitive, occasionally detonating prematurely when striking debris or large fish. Loading the projectiles in heavy seas was dangerous work. Each mortar had to be manhandled into its spigot while the ship rolled and pitched. Several crew members were injured during reloading operations, and at least one sailor was killed when a projectile fell and its fuse activated. Commander Anthony Kimmins, who served aboard HMS Hesperus, noted in his diary that the men respect the Hedgehog, but they don't love it. Too much can go wrong. 1943 also brought desperate German countermeasures as Admiral Karl Dönitz realized his U-boats were dying at unsustainable rates. In his headquarters in Berlin, surrounded by maps showing the shrinking hunting grounds of his submarine fleet, Dönitz demanded answers from his technical staff. The interrogations of captured British sailors had revealed the existence of a forward-throwing weapon, though details remained scarce. German naval intelligence designated it Gert Eagle, the Hedgehog device, and made it a priority target for study. When U-751 was depth-charged to the surface in June of 1943 and scuttled by her crew, Royal Navy boarding parties discovered that the submarine's commander had issued standing orders regarding new Allied weapons. According to material referenced in Clay Blair's comprehensive study, Hitler's U-boat war, German submarine crews were instructed to dive to maximum depth and maintain absolute silence if they suspected a destroyer equipped with forward-throwing weapons was nearby. This defensive posture, while prudent, effectively removed the submarine from combat, achieving the Allied goal even without a kill. Dönitz's response was characteristically aggressive. He accelerated the development of acoustic torpedoes that could home in on a destroyer's propeller noise, hoping to sink Hedgehog-equipped vessels before they could close to attack range. The T-5 Zonkonig torpedo entered service in September of 1943, and for a brief period the tactical balance shifted again. Several destroyers were damaged or sunk by these weapons, and the Admiralty seriously considered withdrawing Hedgehog-equipped vessels from frontline service to protect the valuable weapons systems. Lieutenant Commander Peter Gretton, now commanding his own ship, HMS Duncan, refused to be intimidated. He'd seen what the Hedgehog could accomplish and developed counter-tactics to deal with acoustic torpedoes. His solution was elegant in its simplicity: attach noise-making decoys called Foxer devices behind the destroyer, drawing the torpedo away from the ship's vulnerable stern. Then, once the torpedo was committed to the decoy, turn sharply and attack the U-boat with the Hedgehog while she was still reloading her tubes. This cat-and-mouse game played out across the North Atlantic throughout the autumn of 1943. German submarines would fire acoustic torpedoes from beyond Hedgehog range. Destroyers would deploy decoys and counterattack, and the casualty lists on both sides grew steadily longer. But the mathematics remained inexorable. Britain could replace destroyers faster than Germany could build submarines, and the Hedgehog's superior kill rate meant that each encounter favored the Allies more than it had in previous years. The weapon's reputation spread beyond the Atlantic. In the Mediterranean, where U-boats operated in shallower, clearer waters against Malta convoys, Hedgehog-equipped escorts achieved even higher success rates. Blankney sank 2 submarines in a single action off Cape Bon, an achievement that would have been nearly impossible with depth charges alone. In the Arctic convoys to Murmansk, where German submarines had to operate in restricted waters to intercept the heavily defended merchant ships, the Hedgehog proved devastating. Between November of 1943 and February of 1944, Arctic convoy escort sank 11 U-boats for the loss of only 2 destroyers, a kill ratio that would have seemed fantastical 2 years earlier. 1944 brought Allied dominance in the Battle of the Atlantic, but the human stories behind the statistics revealed a more complex truth. For every U-boat sunk by a Hedgehog attack, 40 or 50 young German men died, submariners who had volunteered for what they believed was a heroic service, trapped in steel coffins as freezing water burst through ruptured hulls. The moral weight of this industrial-scale killing affected even the victors. Commander Roland, who had witnessed the Hedgehog's first successes, found himself increasingly troubled by the weapon's efficiency. After sinking U-423 in February of 1944, his crew pulled 3 survivors from the wreckage buoys, really none older than 22, suffering from hypothermia and severe injuries. One of them, a mechanic named Klaus Becker, kept repeating a phrase in broken English. "We heard nothing, nothing at all." The terror in his voice was something Roland would remember decades later, long after the war had ended and the parades were forgotten. The destroyer crews developed their own rituals and superstitions around the Hedgehog. On HMS Starling, Captain Frederick Walker's highly successful second support group flagship, the loading crew would chalk messages on the mortar before firing them names of sunken merchant ships, lost shipmates, sometimes just for England, Walker himself, who would sink more submarines than any other Allied commander, drove his ships and men relentlessly, achieving results that bordered on the superhuman. His Hedgehog crews could reload and fire 3 complete salvos in the time it took most ships to fire 2, a testament to brutal training and unwavering discipline. But Walker's success came at a cost that transcended tactics and weaponry. He pushed himself as hard as he pushed his men, surviving on 4 hours of sleep per night, eating irregularly, refusing to take leave even when ordered. The strain of command in the Atlantic, of making life-and-death decisions in split seconds, of weighing the lives of merchant seamen against those of his own crew, of hunting men with the same single-minded focus that Dinitz's aces had once brought to hunting convoys, extracted a terrible price. In July of 1944, at the age of 48, Frederick Walker suffered a massive stroke aboard Starling and died, his body finally succumbing to stresses his will had denied for too long. The German submarine service suffered even more catastrophically. Of the approximately 39,000 men who served in U-boats during World War II, 28,000 died, a casualty rate of 72%, the highest of any military service in any nation during the entire conflict. The Hedgehog was responsible for a significant portion of these deaths, particularly after mid-1943, when the weapon became standard equipment on escort vessels. Gunther Preen, the celebrated ace who had sunk HMS Royal Oak in Scapa Flow early in the war, died when his U-boat was destroyed by depth charges in March of 1941, before the Hedgehog entered widespread service. But Otto Kretschmer, another legendary commander, was captured in March of 1941 and later interviewed extensively about German tactics. He observed that the later generation of U-boat commanders faced weapons and tactics far more lethal than what he had encountered. "We had a chance to fight," he said. "They had only a chance to die." 1944 also saw a continuous refinement of the Hedgehog system as British engineers addressed the weapon's remaining limitations. The Mark X version, which entered service that summer, featured improved fuses that reduced premature detonations and a more reliable firing mechanism that worked consistently even in severe weather. The Royal Canadian Navy, which had adopted the Hedgehog enthusiastically for its corvette escorts, developed a simplified version that could be maintained by less experienced crews in remote ports like St. John's and Halifax. The weapon's success inspired imitation. The United States Navy developed its own forward-throwing anti-submarine weapon called Mousetrap, a scaled-down version of the Hedgehog with fewer projectiles but similar principles. American destroyer escorts operating in the Pacific used these weapons against Japanese submarines with considerable success, though the Japanese submarine service never posed the existential threat that Dinitz's U-boats had represented. The Soviet Navy, after receiving technical specifications through the Lend-Lease program, attempted to manufacture their own version but struggled with the precision engineering required for the contact fuses. By the autumn of 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic was effectively won. German submarines still sailed, still occasionally sank merchant ships, but the convoy system combined with Hedgehog-equipped escorts and long-range aircraft had made U-boat operations suicidal rather than merely dangerous. Dönitz, promoted to commander-in-chief of the entire German Navy after Grand Admiral Erich Raeder's dismissal, continued sending submarines to sea largely because Hitler demanded it, knowing that each patrol was likely a death sentence for the crew. The final major Hedgehog action occurred in January of 1945, when HMS Loch Killen, a frigate specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare, detected and destroyed U-1000-055 near the Hebrides. The U-boat was one of the new Type 21 submarines' revolutionary designs with streamlined hulls, massive battery capacity, and the ability to remain submerged far longer than conventional boats. These submarines represented Germany's last hope for regaining the initiative in the Atlantic, but they entered service too late and in too few numbers to affect the war's outcome. The Hedgehog that killed U-1000-055 demonstrated that even technological breakthroughs couldn't overcome the combination of superior tactics, better weapons, and overwhelming numbers that the Allies now deployed. Commander Douglas Pearce, who had commanded Hedgehog-equipped escorts throughout 1944 and 45, wrote in his after-action reports that the weapon's greatest value wasn't in its direct lethality, but in its psychological effect. U-boat commanders who knew Hedgehogs were present in an escort screen were far more cautious, far more likely to break off attacks or dive to extreme depths where they couldn't effectively operate. "We controlled their behavior," Pearce wrote, which meant we controlled the battlefield. 1945 brought victory in Europe and a final accounting of the Battle of the Atlantic. When historians and military analysts assembled the statistics, the Hedgehog's impact became undeniable. Ships equipped with the weapon had sunk approximately 50 U-boats during the war, roughly 6% of all German submarine losses, but representing a disproportionate share of late-war kills when the weapon was most widely deployed. More significantly, the presence of Hedgehog-equipped escorts had disrupted dozens of German attacks, forcing submarines to break contact or dive deep, preventing them from attacking convoys even when they weren't directly engaged. The conventional wisdom that the mockers laughed until results proved them wrong oversimplifies a complex story. Many of the initial skeptics had legitimate concerns about replacing proven systems with unproven technology. Their caution wasn't mere obstinacy, it was the natural conservatism of professionals, who knew that failed experiments in wartime meant dead sailors and sunken ships. What changed minds wasn't rhetoric or theory, but demonstrated effectiveness under combat conditions, verified by rigorous statistical analysis and confirmed by the testimony of both friend and foe. Professor Blackett's operational research, which had first identified the Hedgehog's superior performance, became a model for post-war military analysis. The concept that weapon systems should be evaluated through quantitative data rather than subjective impressions seemed obvious in retrospect but represented a radical shift in military culture. The Royal Navy's willingness to embrace this approach, to let mathematicians and physicists question the judgment of experienced commanders, contributed as much to victory as any individual weapon system. The human cost remained the inescapable background to all technical achievements. The merchant sailors who died in the early years of the war, when depth charges were the only anti-submarine weapon available, numbered in the tens of thousands. The German submariners who died throughout the conflict, many of them killed by Hedgehogs in the final 2 years, were also sons, brothers, husbandsmen who had answered their nation's call and paid with their lives. The weapon's efficiency, while tactically and strategically valuable, represented thousands of individual tragedies on both sides. In the decades after the war, the Hedgehog faded from public consciousness even as it remained in service with various navies into the 1960s. Modern anti-submarine rockets and homing torpedoes rendered forward-throwing mortar obsolete. But the principles the Hedgehog embodied, maintaining sensor contact during attack, using precision rather than blast effect, adapting weapons to tactical realities, continued to influence naval weapons development. When the Royal Navy finally retired its last Hedgehog-equipped vessel in 1967, the ceremony was small and poorly attended, a quiet ending for a weapon that had helped turn the tide of the war's longest campaign. Commander James Rowland, who had witnessed both the mockery and the triumph, lived to see the weapon's final retirement. In a 1972 interview with the Imperial War Museum's Oral History Project, he reflected on the lessons of the Hedgehog controversy. "We almost let pride and tradition prevent us from adopting a weapon that would save thousands of lives. That's the real story, not that we eventually got it right, but that we nearly got it catastrophically wrong because we couldn't look past what we already knew to see what we needed to learn." The Battle of the Atlantic claimed approximately 72,000 Allied seamen and 30,000 merchant vessels by war's end. German submarine losses totaled 783 boats and approximately 28,000 crew members. These numbers, sterile and abstract in retrospect, represented the largest and longest conventional military campaign in history. The Hedgehog, that rotating drum that senior officers had mocked in 1941, didn't win the battle alone. No single weapon ever could. But it represented something essential: the willingness to question assumptions, embrace innovation, and let results speak louder than reputation. In the end, that quality proved as decisive as any torpedo or depth charge, and its legacy extended far beyond the cold waters of the North Atlantic, where so many on both sides had fought, suffered, and died.